A bitter oil dispute between Sudan and South Sudan, war-torn Somalia and trade talks, all on the agenda at the African Union's annual summit. But with the continent's many problems still unresolved, just how relevant is the African Union? And is real African unity even achievable? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abougaida. The 18th African Union Summit ends on Monday in Ethiopia with 40 heads of state and government representatives in attendance. New leaders from Tunisia, Libya, as well as South Sudan are among the delegates at the first annual summit after the so-called Arab Spring. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, as well as Chinese officials, are also attending. While the summit is being held at a time of worsening crises across the continent, a bitter oil dispute between Sudan and South Sudan and war and hunger in Somalia are expected to dominate this year's summit. African leaders have also failed to choose a new chairman for their union's executive commission, and a new election is now scheduled to be held in June. Well, the first day of the summit focused on the need for peace and stability on the continent, as well as further regional integration. All right, let's just take a closer look at some of those issues that are being discussed at that summit. Firstly, as we're saying, the oil dispute between Sudan and South Sudan has become what the UN chief is calling a serious threat to peace and security in the region. South Sudan has now shut down all of its production because of a dispute over export fees. And that's combined with an ongoing humanitarian crisis in the south, where an estimated 120,000 people are in need of aid, and that's because of a wave of ethnic clashes there. Then, of course, there's war and famine in Somalia, which has also dominated this year's summit. That country has been in a state of anarchy for 20 years, and the situation is getting more complex. Now, the lack of trade between member states was a central issue at this year's summit, with many calling for a quick economic integration in the continent. Let's analyze the ability and relevance of the African Union with our guest. Joining us from Cairo is Gamal Nkrumah. He's an African affairs analyst and international editor at Al Ahram English Weekly. Over in Nairobi, Ali Khan Sachu, financial analyst and CEO of Rich Management. And in Cambridge, we're joined by Abdel Wahab Al Effendi, reader in politics at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster. Welcome all of you gentlemen to this edition of Inside Story. It's very good to have you all with us. Gamal Nkrumah over in Cairo, if I can start over with you. The official theme of the summit this year, the African Union Summit, is trade. But just how much do you think that the issue of the dispute between Sudan and South Sudan actually dominated the talks?
Yes, obviously there are many issues, some of them pressing. This year, this summit is especially important because it's the first major summit after the Arab Spring, which affected many North African countries.
Right.
Most notably Egypt, Libya and Tunisia. Now, the most important thing is the absence of Gaddafi, the late Libyan leader, who was the power behind the foundation of the African Union, and who was one of the main financial backers of the AU. And so This is the first summit without Gaddafi as the showy figurehead of the African summit.
Right. We're going to get on to all of those issues that you just raised, Gamal, in just a moment. But first, I just want to go back to the issue of Sudan and South Sudan for the time being. And Abdel Wahab Al Effendi over in Cambridge, in your opinion, what is the possibility of success at a conference such as this of the African Union to walk away with a plan in place to find a resolution to the conflict between Sudan and South Sudan?
Well, already a couple of days ago, there was a summit in Addis Ababa just prior to this summit, where President Bashir and President Salva Kiir of the South were meeting with also President Meles Zenawi, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, and the President Kibaki of Kenya. And there was a proposal which was put to them. The President Bashir signed, but President Salva Kiir refused to sign. Now, they're hoping to bring now the whole weight of the African Union behind that proposal or something very similar to it, and hopefully to get some results, although it doesn't seem very likely that they could get something out of that at the moment, given the tensions. But the tensions are quite a big worry for the African Union. As you have said, they would rather have concentrated on trade, but always in Africa, conflicts do seem to jump out of the shadows and scupper their plans.
Abdel Wahad El-Sawi is an advisor to Sudan's president, gentlemen, and just listen for a second to what he had to say on this oil dispute between Sudan and South Sudan.
We want the international community to put pressure on our brothers in the South so that they can be more flexible and accept the proposals of the mediation so that we can move forward. But everybody to be entrenched in his position, this will lead to nowhere.
Ali Khan Sachu in Nairobi, let me come to you now, because China is an honored guest this year, in fact, at the African Union Summit. And China is also the biggest buyer of oil from Sudan and South Sudan. Is there a role here that China can play in settling this dispute?
I think that's a very interesting question, and I think China has been trying to play some kind of role, albeit not too successfully. But I think more than that, Sudan has now become the epicenter of a collision between America and China. And I think post-Libya, where 35,000 Chinese workers were evacuated in 72 hours, and China was rolled back and out of Libya in a very short order, I think you have to look at Sudan right now through the prism of this great power collision. And I think essentially the US is backing the South and has to have had to underwrite the overdraft that Salva must be incurring now. 350,000 barrels per day at $100 is no small potatoes. And I think it's in that context that we've got to look at the situation in Sudan. It's not just a Bashir-Salva issue. I think it's more a US-China issue, and the US would be quite satisfied if 500,000 barrels per day was cut off from China's imports. And that's where I see this situation developing, and I think it's really the epicenter of this collision which started to accelerate post-Libya.
Gamal, China has also gifted, in fact, the African Union, the new headquarters, $200 million it's cost them. How do you see China's relationship going forward with the African Union? Does the AU need China now that Gaddafi is gone? Like you mentioned just a few moments ago, Gaddafi was behind the establishment of the African Union, and he also bankrolled it.
Yes, this is the issue. Now, the big players behind the scenes, not necessarily members of the AU. China being one of the most important trading partners of Africa. However, we have to distinguish between two things. The first is that China's relation on a governmental level, official level, with African governments is excellent. I would describe it as exemplary. However, there is, on a different level, there are, as the incident recently, a couple of days ago, and today some of the hostages were released, when some Chinese nationals were abducted, I think, in Sudan. And I think such incidents are especially important because they are indicators that that behind the official exemplary relations between China and African governments, mainly because the Chinese don't interfere politically in African affairs. They're only interested in economic affairs and trade, commercial affairs. But however, this incident of Sudan, of the abduction of Chinese nationals working in Sudan, highlights some of the tensions that you have had in the past year or so in many African countries, in which there is obvious resentment by certain sectors, employees, and Africans generally about some of the behavior of Chinese nationals working in Africa.
All right, let's bring in Abdel Wahab Gamal.
This might be an issue which might cause future problems. However, I must stress that the Chinese are very quick to deal with such issues on a diplomatic matter, because what's important to China is that it expands its trading relations with Africa, and Africa, the growing Chinese economy, sees Africa as a major source of raw materials, minerals.
Okay. All right. Let me bring in Abdel Wahab. Okay, Gamal. Thank you very much for that analysis. Let me bring in Abdel Wahab for just a moment.
And natural gas.
Let me get Abdel Wahab's take. Gamal describing rather the relationship between African countries and China as exemplary. Is that how you see it, and how do you see the relationship between African countries and China?
Yes, first a brief comment on whether the Sudanese case is a collision between China and America. I don't think that's accurate. It's correct that the Sudan was the only probably area where oil exploration was done by non-Western companies. But even now the South is going to build a new pipeline through the Chinese. And the Chinese still hold a substantial, the Chinese, the Indians, the Malaysians still hold a substantial stake in oil in the South. And the second thing, Sudan has been actually a collision area between the West and the United Nations on the one hand and the African Union on the other hand. The African Union saw Sudan as one of its possible success stories. The African Union leads the peacekeeping force in Darfur. There was an attempt by America and the West to take this over from the African Union. This still continues to be a matter of tension. The African Union is still also through the high-level panel led by President Thabo Mbeki, leading also the negotiation between North and South. But there is an input in Western input in this. If the South stops producing oil for 2 years, it will need heavy bankrolling from abroad to compensate for that loss of income. And only the U.S. now appears to be willing to do this. So there is the African Union might see in this a reduction of its leverage. If the U.S. can come in and pay the South to stop its oil for 2 years, then the African Union will have less leverage on the South than it would desire.
All right, you didn't answer my question on China, but let me go back to Ali in Nairobi for just a moment, because just one moment, please. Yeah. Let me allow him to respond to you, because you were responding to a comment that he had made earlier on. Go ahead, Ali Khan Sachu.
Can I first come back to the AU, the $200 million building in Addis Ababa? It's a clear example of how China likes to conduct foreign policy. It's an example of soft power. It's monumental. It's going to capture people's attention.
Okay,
and
are there going to, since you addressed China, let me ask you,
exemplary...
since you addressed China, then let me ask you, will there be strings attached to China's offer of assistance?
Absolutely, there are strings attached. It is completely naive to believe that just because who has all the money and $3 trillion in reserves, that China is not extracting very advantageous terms in each transaction it does. I mean, recently, not so long ago, the World Bank rolled back the resource for cash swap that China wanted to do in the DRC Congo. They're obviously gouging Iran on price right now for the fuel. China is not a sort of beneficial player across the global economy. I mean, you know, that's a fiction. They're in there to do business. They have been a great help to Africa in the last 10 years. The trade flow is really, it tells you the whole story. They've made the demand side of the equation for African raw materials much fairer. They've injected some competition. They've unleashed money for African countries who previously could only borrow 1 year ahead. They didn't know what the price of the commodity would be. China waded in and says, you know what, we'll make your price for 5 years. And we'll also make your loan off the back of that price.
Okay,
so that's been very, very transformative. But you know,
all right.
Sorry.
Okay. I do apologize for interrupting you, but we'll have to move away from China because there is a lot to talk about, because there are a lot of issues that were addressed at the African Union summit. Abdelwahab Al-Effendi over in Cambridge, the fact that the AU has now walked away and was not able to elect a chairman, that vote, as we know, has ended in deadlock. Does that hinder the AU's capabilities to solve some of the long-standing issues such as poverty, such as corruption in Africa, and those that are not so long-standing, such as the Sudan and South Sudan dispute that we're talking about right now?
Yes, I think that was an unusual move from South Africa. South Africa was supposed to be the leading light in the African continent. It's supposed to be helping with development because it's a richer country. It is unusual for an African country to challenge an incumbent secretary or head of the African Union, the executive secretary, and it seems that it has created divisions within the African Union on this, because Jan Ping was not renewed too, but Mrs. Zuma was also not elected. There's a deep division now. They have to have a temporary secretary for 6 months. And hold the election again in July.
Right.
This wouldn't augur well for relations, and as you said, will not let them concentrate on the task of this summit, which is the inter-African trade.
Let me go over to Ali Khan Sachu in Nairobi for just a moment. Ali Khan, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he was also at the AU summit. Is there perhaps a closer relationship now that's being established between the AU and the United Nations?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think the AU is a little bit, I mean, I think Jean Ping in particular, you know, that $200 million building in Addis Ababa should have seen him voted in, but clearly there are issues around leadership at the moment, and I think the UN Secretary General being there was actually to see what those issues were post-Gaddafi, and I think what's clear is the African Union hasn't settled on its new direction post the Gaddafi dispensation. And I think this process will probably take a little bit longer. It couldn't fit into the news cycle of this particular conference that we had in the last couple of days.
Abdelwahab Al-Effendi, Jacob Zuma, the president of South Africa, speaking of the United Nations, actually, he was at the UN earlier this month, and he said that the West's continued interference in Africa contributes to the hesitance of African countries to take whatever decisions are needed for the AU to function. Does he have a point?
I think there is a point there, but it is also an African problem. There was also another, the outgoing president of the AU has also hinted or actually said openly that African leaders are like puppets being moved from abroad. But in the same summit, Meles Zenawi had given an upbeat talk saying that there's an African renaissance. Africa, they used to be only a few years ago saying, let us recolonize Africa. Now nobody is saying that. Africa is becoming more reliant, more economically viable, also more open politically and more viable. So it is not, I think there is too much complaining by some African leaders, and usually they are the ones who have problems, like the Mugabes, and Jacob Zuma has problems internally. And I don't think South Africa, there's people are interfering in its affairs because it's rich and self-reliant. The way African leaders complain about interference is when they are themselves the cause of the problems.
Gamal, is the West to blame for some of the African Union's shortcomings, as the president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, seemed to be saying at the United Nations?
Yes, I think South Africa is destined to play a major role because it's the economic powerhouse of the southern part of the continent. And I think without Gaddafi, who was the main bankroller of the AU, I think that fewer North African countries are going to be able to fill in that gap.
So who will fill in that gap?
Sorry?
Who will fill in that gap? Will it be countries like Nigeria, like South Africa? Who will it be?
Well, there are five main funders of the AU: South Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, Libya in the past, and Egypt. Now, Libya is out of the question because the ruling National Transitional Council has reservations about the AU's delay in recognizing the NTC. Egypt is embroiled in its own domestic affairs at the moment in the post-revolutionary situation. And however, there are indications that Egypt wants to expand its relations with Africa, especially the Nile Basin countries and the Horn of Africa. So that's a good sign. However, Egypt does not have the resources that Gaddafi had. And Algeria also cannot fill in this gap. And Nigeria has domestic tensions. So the obvious choice, the country that seems to, the spotlight is on it at the moment, to rescue the situation is South Africa, in spite of its own domestic challenges. However, South Africa and a couple of other oil producers in Africa, such as Angola, might come in and play a more prominent role in the affairs, in the funding, because that's the main challenge that South Africa, that the AU has, is the funding of the AU.
All right.
And that's the major challenge.
Okay, let me just put one final question, if I may, to Abdel Wahab Al Afandi over in Cambridge, because a lot of people are probably thinking and wondering about this. Will 2012 see more African leaders leave leave their countries and their positions?
Well, I think Africa has made a lot of progress before on the democratic front, rather than its Arab northern tier, which has been really very, very backward. So I don't see there has been some attempts to mimic the Arab Spring in countries like Uganda, to a less extent Ethiopia, and Senegal. But most of these countries Senegal in particular is a democratic country, and has been one of the leading lights in democratization. And the African Union itself has played a very positive role in helping democratization in its countries, and made it a condition since the African Union was made for membership.
Okay. Thank you very much for that final comment. I'd like to thank all my guests, Gamal Nkrumah, Ali Khan Sachu, and Abdul Wahab Al Effendi. Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. And we thank our viewers for watching. You can send us your feedback. You can email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me and the team, thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.